Welcome back to Gary's Economics. Today we are going to cover everything you've missed on the economy. Okay, so to do this video, I went back and had a look at my video from last year, bringing you up to speed with the economy. And that video last year, I was saying that inflation would come back to pretty much target, interest rates would start to fall, we would see an enormous increase in stock prices, an enormous increase in the gold price, and we would see house prices start to go as interest rates start to fall. But despite all of that, we would continue to see living standards and poverty continue to decline. And this is basically everything we've seen in the last year. I also said that Labour would win the election, probably by a decent margin, because the Conservatives were failing on the economy and were super unpopular, but that Labour would very quickly become unpopular on coming into power. So if you've been keeping up to speed with what we've been doing, you won't be pissed off that I was away for 6 months because you already knew exactly what was going to happen. So what are we going to cover now? Okay, so this year we're going to cover a few of the things which happened while I was away, which I've not been able to talk about yet, and their economic impact. In particular, Labour's budget in the autumn and the Trump election. We're going to talk about how this year and the coming year will be different from last year. We're going to talk about a little bit about what's going to happen in the economy and what's going to happen in financial markets. So I want to start with how this year is different from last year, because when I went and watched last year's video, I was quite struck by basically how much was the same. So I had to look at financial markets before I shot this video, and basically everything is at an all-time high. Most major stock markets are at or near their all-time highs in terms of price. The gold price is at or near its all-time high. House prices are shooting up to new all-time highs. We're starting to see them start to really go. And it's kind of deja vu all over again. So I was quite shocked. And I think that really underlines basically how aggressive these increases in asset prices have been. And I think it's important to talk about that, because I think what we see on the news and what most of us understand about the economy is that living standards have really failed to recover and they continue to slide. And that gives the impression of a very weak economy. And I do think we have a very weak economy. But what is often not spoken about is this fact that if you're looking at the economy from the perspective of the asset holders, which is basically from the perspective of the rich, things are really good. Everything is at massive all-time highs. So you're going to see the rich people seeing continued increase in their wealth. They're basically doing the best they've ever done. And I think this basically kind of underlines the point which I've been making for a long time, which is this is not an economic crisis for everyone. This is an economic crisis for you, while the rich do really well, which I think kind of underlines that this is a crisis of inequality. But I think what is probably most interesting that is different about the economy now compared to last year is when I did my video last year, inflation was still just above 4% in this country. And there was still this kind of perception that we were living in a very weak economy because we were still in the kind of economic aftermaths of COVID. And there was still this kind of perception that, well, we're screwed at the moment because COVID was really bad, because of the Russia-Ukraine war, but we're going to come through that and things will be better. And yet here we are a year later and we've started to see pretty much everything normalize. Inflation is pretty much back down to or around target in most countries. Commodity prices, which went up in the war in Ukraine, most of those are back down to the same levels they were before the war in Ukraine. Interest rates are starting to come back down again. Unemployment is at normal levels. GDP is back higher than it was before COVID. And yet, despite the fact that everything has kind of normalized, living standards for ordinary people are still significantly worse. There's two things about this. The first one is that I think this firstly underlines that the thing I've been saying for a long time, which is what we are seeing economically, the reason for the fall in living conditions, is not about supply chain problems during COVID or about the aftermath of the Ukraine war. What we are seeing is a permanent decrease in living standards because we had a permanent increase in inequality. I think the first thing is it's becoming harder to spin what you're seeing as temporary because it's becoming more increasingly permanent. The second thing about that is it creates this kind of interesting situation in politics, which is basically every country that had an election, the political party that was in power significantly lost their election. They got basically smashed. And this is because people are seeing, well, the economy is permanently broken and people won't change. And yet no political party has really sort of got a pitch. So as the centre has failed and there's been a loss of faith in this idea that what's happening is temporary, and increasing demand in you need to fix it, you need to change what's happening, the centre has collapsed and you're seeing basically a complete political reformation. What you have is political parties need to change their messaging on the economy. They need to say we're going to do something dramatically different. And you're starting to see those new kind of messages take shape. So I think when you talk about the US election, you can kind of see, and also the UK election really, you can kind of see what the new message is from the right of politics, which is the problem is migration, the problem is foreigners, and if you want to fix the problem, we need to be tougher on migration, we need to be tougher on foreigners. You can see that in Trump's rhetoric, you can see that in Nigel Farage's rhetoric over here, you can see that in basically all of the politics of Europe. That is basically a new message being put together, and that is a smart message, and that is a message which has been very popular throughout history. You know, we saw this in the early 20th century from the political right. The reason that is smart is because when these anti-immigration, anti-foreigner political parties get into power, and they increasingly will get into power, we're seeing it across Europe, we're seeing it in the States. As these guys get into power, they will fail to fix the economy. And the reason they will fail to fix the economy is because they are not dealing with the fundamental problem, which is growing wealth inequality. But you've kind of got your excuse already built in, which is we tried our best to hit the foreigners, to hit the immigrants. The left didn't let us go far enough. You need to let us go further. And you know, this is the kind of slide which we saw in the early 20th century, which led eventually to people like Hitler and Mussolini getting into power. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that Trump is Hitler, I'm not saying that Farage is Hitler. These guys will win power, they will fail to fix the economy, and the obvious political move then will be to go further right. And whilst these guys themselves are not Hitler, the only path that they will be able to go as they fail, because they can't deal with inequality, because they're not dealing with inequality, they will simply be forced further and further right over time, and you will see more and more increasingly far-right politicians getting into power, basically. And that's the new space on the right. So what's the new space on the left? And I think that is where we start talking about the Labour budget and the election. So Labour won the election on an extremely small number of votes. They actually got, I think, 5% less votes than they got in 2019, where they got absolutely smashed. So their actual number of votes went down, and they won simply because of complete collapse in popularity of the Conservative Party. So they didn't really need to have much of an economic message because they won simply sort of by default of not being the Conservatives. And then what do they want to do when they're in power? I think if you were to pull an average man or woman to the side in the street and say, what do you think is Labour's economic plan? What do you think is Keir Starmer's economic plan? I think most people would not know what it was. I don't think they have a clearly communicated economic plan. And if you were to ask me what it was, it's kind of let's just be really sensible. It's kind of a new sensibilism. This kind of belief that if you just do the status quo hard enough, if you're just sensible enough, things will get better. It's pretty weak. It will fail. And I think it's interesting to look at what happened in the budget, it was a relatively modest budget. They raised taxes a very small amount. They raised spending a very small amount. They raised borrowing by a very small amount. And yet people weren't happy with it, and the financial markets almost refused the budget, really. You saw government borrowing costs go up a little bit. I think what it shows basically is that Labour and the left are basically clinging to a failed economic orthodoxy. Increasingly what is clear is we live in an economy where more and more and more is being owned by the rich. So you are left with basically a choice. Either you tax the rich more, or you just accept that you are poor now. And the government is sort of trying to toe this middle ground. We're going to borrow a bit more, we're going to spend a bit more. It's not going to work, it's going to fail, and we're not going to see economic improvement. Okay, so what does that mean? We are still living in an economy which is dominated by the growth in inequality that happened over COVID. We are seeing the consequences which you would imagine you would see if you significantly increased economic inequality, which is a significant increase in living standards for the rich and a significant decrease in living standards for the rest. Once you increase inequality, first thing I will say is we are not going to see the kind of rapid declines we saw during COVID unless there is another economic disaster, because that rapid speed of increase in inequality was a one-off. But that leaves us now at a high level of inequality. And if inequality is higher, that means ordinary people are paying more interest to the rich, the government is paying more interest to the rich, ordinary people are paying more rents to the rich, and the rich are receiving more interest and more rents. So high levels of inequality lead to high levels of increasing inequality, because it leads to high levels of payments from the poor and from governments to the rich. So that means we're on basically a steeper gradient of permanent decline now. And you're going to just see this continued immiseration. Living standards will continue to fall, and at the same time, because the rich are getting richer, asset prices will continue to increase. I should probably be clear on my predictions about asset prices, because in the past I've predicted very, very aggressive rises in asset prices that have happened. This time last year, I had a massive long position on gold, and I've really cut it back a lot because of the unbelievable speed of the increase. Gold prices and stock prices have gone up unbelievably huge in the last few years. I think that's justified because of the massive increase of the wealth of the richest. But I couldn't tell you with confidence they'll be higher in a year's time, just because when things go up that quickly, they do tend to come back down a little bit. The one thing which I think will really go this year is house prices. Interest rates have started to fall. They will probably continue to fall a little bit more. We'll probably see another sort of 0.75%, 1% come off Bank of England and Federal Reserve US base rates in the next year or so. Once those interest rates go, house price will really start to go. House prices have been kind of left behind in this really aggressive asset price rally. And that is because it's much harder for rich people to directly buy a ton of housing. So when rich people make an enormous amount of money like they did in COVID, it's super easy for them to go into financial markets, buy stocks, buy gold. And that's why you've seen this massive increase in stock prices and gold prices. It's much more complicated for a rich person to go out and buy and manage, 100 properties. The way that rich people buy properties, and I think I'll probably do a video on this at some point, is kind of through the banking system and through the mortgage system. They put the money in the bank and the banks lend you the money to buy a mortgage. And because interest rates have been so high, it has made it difficult basically for ordinary people to pass those eligibility checks. And it's kind of blocking rich people from buying housing. What they want to do is lend you money so you can buy a house, and they kind of indirectly own your house through your mortgage. But because of very high interest rates, they're not being able to do that. As soon as rates come down, you're really going to start seeing house prices go. With regards to interest rates and inflation, these will both come down. For a long time, I've had kind of a slightly ambiguous view on this, which is because the middle class is being really smashed and ordinary people's spending power is being really smashed, this should have the effect of really bringing prices down and bringing inflation down, which would bring interest rates down. But it also has this secondary effect of just really massively increasing poverty, which then kind of forces governments to spend a lot more money because people have desperate need and the government kind of has an obligation to help the people, which is why you've seen much high levels of spending and government deficits, sustained high government deficits, and those high government deficits will tend to end up with the rich and will tend to push prices up again. So there's a kind of a balanced view on whether inflation rates come down. I think they will, but how quickly and how far kind of depends on how much money governments spend. I think you're kind of getting to a point here where basically nothing governments do works. And that is because there's this kind of absurd, really stubborn unwillingness of governments on either left or right to accept that inequality might be the problem. What you're seeing is kind of, you've got an economy that is dying of cancer and a political system that does not believe cancer exists. So they keep trying to do a lot of sensible seeming fixes, like more investment and, let's just, be more efficient and let's try and search for growth. You can't grow your way out of a cancer. There's a gaping hole in the bottom of the ship that needs to be fixed. Neither right nor left has any real understanding. So I think the only hope we have, if we want to prevent more economic worsening, is to really force this idea into the political mainstream that inequality is the problem. Until then, we will see continued economic worsening, and that will be combined with continuing rises in asset prices, which means the rich will get richer and richer. It's another very pessimistic economic picture, but the only chance we have to prevent this is to really drive inequality as the cause of the economic worsening into the public narrative, into the public consciousness, and into the minds of the politicians. Labour are going to fail on the economy, and they'll be very unpopular in 2 or 3 years. The only thing I can do, and I would hope for any of your support, is try and make this channel big enough that in 3 or 4 years' time, when the next election's coming around and Labour are in desperate need of a rebrand, that we are the best alternative. It's a big ambition, but I think it's our only chance. Inequality is worsening. It will keep getting worse. The economy will keep getting worse. We can fix it. We can reduce inequality. It's about taxing you less and taxing the rich more. We'll be campaigning for it all year long, as long as I can keep it up. And we're grateful for your support. Thank you.